So in this event, we hope we'll cover some of the important questions about Channel 4's remit to represent people across the country and minority audiences, and how all that might be impacted by culturally. Now, although we're in August, it has been a busy month for news, and questions about privatisation loom large, with the deadline for the government's consultation just a few short weeks away. There'll be a lot of talk today about the remit. Channel 4's remit aims to ensure it is distinctive, telling the stories other parts of the media will not, and presenting alternative viewpoints when they do, whether it's through the best news programme on TV, current affairs, entertainment programs like The Last Leg or Grayson's Art Club. And as the channel continues to move its base to Leeds and build outside of London, we've got an esteemed panel for you this morning who understand the power of commissioning outside of London when it comes to building local businesses, and crucially representing audience needs throughout the country. And with their help, what we hope to come to understand this morning is what businesses, audiences and the creative sector stand to gain or to lose from privatisation should it go ahead. So let me bring in our panel, and apologies if anyone was expecting to see Lisa McGee. She is unavailable this morning. Commitments just come up at the last minute, but we have a brilliant replacement for you who I'll come to. But first of all, let me introduce Melanie Leach, who you should be able to see. She's the chief executive of South Shore Productions, a vastly experienced TV executive who previously ran 4's productions, and her credits include the Emmy Award-winning Educating series for Channel 4, The Real Marigold Hotel for the BBC, and Hotel Inspector, now Channel 5's longest-running show. We've also got for you Marcus Ryder, who's the head of external consultancies at Lenny Henry Media Diversity Centre, as well as being a media diversity expert. Marcus is a news and current affairs executive who has worked for Caixin, CGTN, and was head of current affairs at BBC Scotland for almost 10 years. We have David Elstein, who was the launch CEO for Channel 5 and has held a number of senior roles across the media since then. So welcome to David. And finally, the person who is not Lisa McGee is Alan Clements, and he is the MD of Two Rivers Media in Scotland. Prior to this, he ran the Walk Clements business and then negotiated the merger with Ideal World to create IWC Media, which is Scotland's largest independent producer. So welcome to you all, and let's kick off by inviting you all to speak for 2 minutes about your understanding of Channel 4's unique remit and what's at stake if privatisation were to take place. So David Elstein, will you kick us off, please?
Oh, well, the first thing to say is that Channel 4's remit is mostly mythical. It has a requirement to do 4 hours a week of national and international news in peak time. It has a requirement to do 4 hours of current affairs, not necessarily peak time and not necessarily original. Everything else is voluntary. So apart from all the percentages, which of course can be fairly meaningless because they're percentages of what? There is no requirement for Channel 4 to broadcast any new programs at all other than news. It already is a 70% repeats channel, but under the current legislation, it could be 90% or 95%, and it would still not be in breach of its remit. The notion that it is meant to share alternative viewpoints, represent minorities across the country, etc., it's all very recent and not particularly, and is unenforceable, by the way. The quota of original productions outside London was 30% 20 years ago and has slowly crept up. But in fact, the proportion of Channel 4's cash that was spent outside England last year was 9%. The proportion of the hours commissioned was 12%. So there's actually quite a long way to go for Channel 4 to be more representative than it should be. That figure should obviously be up at 18%, which is what the proportion of the UK population consists of from Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. So would privatisation have any impact? Well, who would know? Privatisation is the last opportunity the government has to impose a tougher remit on Channel 4
David,
and
require
that from new owners.
That's your 2 minutes, and I'm sure you're going to elaborate on those points further in the hour. So thank you very much for that. And can I invite Melanie Leach, please?
So my perspective on this, I've got to say, is one that's built entirely from self-interest. You know, I'm an independent producer, and I've been an independent producer for 25 years. I started my career working at a very small independent production company in Plymouth, where there were 6 staff, and it was relatively soon after Channel 4 had launched. And I can say with some certainty that, you know, the growth of that company that went on to become 24, you know, which became a super group and is now a really significant player in the independent market, would not have happened if it had not been for the support of Channel 4 through the early stages of 4's incarnation. So right at the beginning, you know, when it was very, very tough to launch companies outside of London, we were able to build something really meaningful and really significant because of the support of Channel 4. You know, and I stayed at 4 for a long time and was very, very proud of what we managed to achieve there. And then recently, 18 months ago, took the decision to move on and to set up another independent production company. So we're now running South Shore. And again, I can say with some certainty, were it not for the fact that Channel 4 was in the marketplace and was providing the sort of support that they provide to small startups like the one I'm now trying to build, I think I'd really thought twice about whether I wanted to take that leap, take that entrepreneurial risk and go again. And, you know, if you stop people from doing that, then you are going to stop job creation in this country. You are going to stop building the wonderful library of IP that we, the independent producers, are creating. You know, we are dependent on Channel 4 for their support and their contribution to the creative ecosystem.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Melanie, for that contribution. And next, can we hear from Marcus Ryder?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. I think it's important to separate the remit from its ownership model. So while I agree with a lot of what David was saying, and I agree with a lot of what Mel was saying, you know, I think that the remit up until 2001. So David's completely right about the remit now, right? But up until 2001, right, they did have to have 7 hours of formal education programs. They did have to have 3 hours of multicultural content. They had to have 1 hour of religious content, right, according to its remit. Then you get the 2003 Communications Act, you get the creation of Ofcom, and its remit and its regulation is a lot more lax, to the point that, as David pointed out, it's only the current affairs and the news at peak, which is now mandatory, right? And so, and if you look at so a lot of this conversation about privatization is saying that it's unique, Channel 4's uniqueness is because of its ownership model. When I think it's a combination of its ownership model with regards to how much of its profits, and it's not called profits, but surplus income, can go into investment into indies and into productions. But a lot of it is also due to the regulatory framework that Ofcom creates. So my position is that I think it is wrong for us to have a conversation solely about privatization, right? And what we need to do is have a conversation about the actual environment and the ecosystem, the broadcasting ecosystem, which Channel 4 exists in, right? Because what we want to do is make sure that we have a channel and a broadcaster which is radical, which is representing diverse views, diverse programming, and we can't do that, and it's not dependent alone on its ownership model. So we need to look at both the ownership and we need to look at how Ofcom regulates it and sets out its remit. But a conversation that only focuses on one, I think, is erroneous, and far too much of the conversation that we've been having currently about it has only been focusing on its actual ownership model.
Thank you, Marcus. You're going to love the next section, which I've been entitled the Channel 4 Remit, but we'll come on to some of the points that you raise about diversity and strengthening alternative voices again further in the hour. And finally, the last of our panelists, Alan Clements, who's the MD of Two Rivers Media in Scotland.
Yeah, thank you, Ciaran. And may I firstly apologise for the massive disappointment of not being Lisa McGee, both personally and I'm sure for everybody attending the seminar. I guess for me, having been asked last night, I would have said that Channel 4 has touched my life as a person, as a producer in so many ways. Now we could talk, as Ciaran has, about the glories of Channel 4 News over the years, or the band season, or the amazing films that Film 4 have brought to the marketplace. But also, I remember the treat and the excitement of my kids being able to stay up late and watch Friends on a Friday night, you know, with a pizza being a huge part of their life. So I've grown up with Channel 4. It's an incredibly important cultural institution. And as a producer, having done everything from a review show in the noughties through to co-producing Escape to the Chateau now, Channel 4 is an important part of my business life. But I think the cultural arguments will be made by people much more eloquent than me. And I'd like to focus on one key business argument, because for me, privatisation is a solution seeking a question. And it reminds me of the joke about French philosophers who say, yes, I know it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And we have no issue with Channel 4 just now. It's working perfectly well. It's supporting a very vibrant creative sector. So why now, and why in this form, and why in this term of such a loaded question of the assumption that privatisation is the right thing? And I think I would focus on one particular thing in this, Ciaran, and it's about terms of trade, because the only way you make Channel 4 attractive to any potential buyer is letting it own IP. And the only way it can own IP is changing the terms of trade in order that the producers own less and the channel owns more. And that's going to create a horrific domino effect, because if Channel 4 changes the terms of trade, every producer who's watching this knows that the BBC and ITV and 5 and everybody else would love to topple those dominoes and bring down terms of trade if they could. And this would be a very, very devastating first step to doing that. And without the terms of trade, there'll be reduced IP for the producers, which makes already quite a difficult business model nearly impossible. And I think that would be a terrible thing for the creative sectors of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Alan. Well, let's leap straight in and tackle that issue of the remit. How unique is it really? How valuable is it really? Because we're living in a world where, of course, there's more choice than ever about what we watch. From news to high-end dramas, you know, people can pretty much find anything they want these days very easily. So how unique is what Channel 4 produces, and how much of that is down to the remit? David Elstein, because I sensed a teeny bit of skepticism from you. Have audiences benefited from Channel 4's remit, do you reckon?
Of course, anything Channel 4 chooses to do and audiences choose to watch is a plus. That Channel 4's audiences halved in the last decade doesn't mean that it's failed. It's transferred a lot of its viewing to its sibling channels like E4 and More 4. The problem is we used to have something called public service broadcasting in this country. And as Marcus pointed out, the 2003 Communications Act effectively put an end to that, because it allowed all the old quotas, not just for Channel 4, but for ITV, to fade away. So children's television disappeared from ITV, along with all kinds of other stuff, a lot of its regional output and so forth. And with Channel 4, it abandoned education, it abandoned religion, it abandoned multiculturalism, and it now has something which is much fluffier and can change at any time. In fact, the latest mantra from the Channel 4 chief executive is that its job is to change the world through entertainment. So actual public service content, which Ofcom used to define as news, current affairs, regional, documentaries, children's, religion, and arts. Channel 4 spends roughly 75 million a year on those categories, and the average UK adult gets 1 minute per day of public service content from Channel 4. So, you know, it's lovely, but it used to be a lot more.
Okay, and Marcus Ryder, who might be concerned about any potential changes to Channel 4's remit? What Channel 4 is asked to do if there were a sale?
The issue really is...
Marcus?
Oh, can you hear me? Hello? I'm having trouble hearing you, but Alan, David, Mel, are you able to hear me?
Yeah,
okay,
we can
fine.
hear you.
Okay, cool. I'll press on. With the question, the issue is not a lot of people, to be honest with you, because as the remit as it stands, is really about current affairs and news at peak time, as the remit as it stands, right? And so it is a cultural, maybe a cultural heritage from leftover from when Channel 4 actually started. But in terms of its remit, it's very ill-defined right now, and it's up to the vagaries of the commissioner and the existing culture, which is at the broadcaster. But very little, if I'm being completely honest, has got to do with the statutory remit. Whereas, as I said, before 2003, the statutory requirements were very clear, its remit was very clear. And so then, you know, there'd be a lot with regards to talk about how the remit might change, you know. But if privatization did occur, and I'm not advocating for privatization at all, right? But if privatization, because I actually agree with Alan, I think it might be a solution looking for a problem, right? But you know, it would be very easy to keep in any remit, any Ofcom license requirement for news and current affairs. What it would affect is not so much the remit. What it would affect, which is why I think so much the industry is complaining, is that it would definitely affect its relationship, which is independent of the remit, but it would affect its relationship with independent producers. Right now, what I'm really happy about this conversation is that Alan and Mel are being incredibly honest as to the vested interest and how it would actually affect independent producers. Whereas I feel that so much of this debate that we've been having over the last weeks and months about Channel 4 privatization is that we've been talking about how it will affect the remit, right? I'm not sure that's really the issue here, right? Now, the real issue, because the remit is so woolly, right? The real issue is that it could easily affect, in order to be profitable, it could easily affect the relationship with independent producers. So I'm very happy to have that discussion as to how it could affect the relationship with independent producers. And I think that is the real issue. I'm not sure the remit is really the issue, although often it is framed in that way, because a lot of people aren't as honest as Mel and Alan and want to pretend that there is no self-interest. They're just worried about the audience, and they're worried about multicultural programming, and they're worried about diverse voices and what have you.
Okay, well, let's ask Melanie then, who is a CEO of a very successful production company. I mean, are you worried about future business in all this for yourself and for other indies? Because of course, BBC and ITV, Netflix and Amazon, you know, they all commission from indies as well. Presumably a privatized Channel 4 would do just the same.
I mean, I don't think we know what a privatised Channel 4 would do, because I think it very much depends what the terms of the regulations are that are put around that sale, and ultimately who a new owner of Channel 4 might be. And so it's very difficult at this stage for us to gauge whether or not it would be business as usual at Channel 4. You know, if the government decide that they want to maximise the value of the asset, then they're very likely to change the model. You know, a publisher broadcaster model is not the most valuable proposition in the market. You know, taking away the restrictions that would allow the channel to commission from an in-house base, or, you know, a studio, if it was owned by a studio, would obviously make it much more commercially attractive to the market, and would make it much, you know, a much more difficult place for independents like mine and Alan's to do business. And so, of course, that is a threat and a worry, and something that we are, as independent producers, concerned about.
And Alan, do you think that the present Channel 4 remit is nebulous and ill-defined, or can you derive some clarity from it? And what do you think there is to lose potentially from privatisation? What might we regret down the line?
Yeah, I think I agree with David and Marcus. I think the remit has been slightly over-egged, but I think, to be fair to Channel 4, it's not just what's written down in its obligations. It's a cultural thing, and we all know as independent producers, when we're in development and somebody comes up with an idea, you go, that's a Channel 4 idea, because culturally it's mischievous or it's diverse. So I think it goes beyond what's written down, to be honest. But I'm not as sure as Mel that the danger is in-house production, because even if you look at Channel 5, which is kind of dabbled in in-house production, I think it's more the terms of trade, as I said at the opening, because if they own all the IP like the American broadcasters do, why not put the production issues and the problems as a production services agreement out to the producers and go, there's a fixed amount of money. If you're over budget, that's your problem. You know, I mean, they could build a Channel 4 studios, it's certainly possible, but the loss of the IP would be a much greater threat to the independent sector. And it's not, I should stress, it's not through a fear of competition. There are, I think, 800 independent producers in the UK, so we're all fiercely competitive. It's more that you can't build a business on a guns for hire basis, however much those the companies pay for those particular guns.
Just before we move on to discuss other issues, while we're on this question of a sale, of course, for there to be a sale, there would have to be a buyer, and the future shape of Channel 4 News and Channel 4 surely depends on who that buyer is. So has anyone given that any thought? Who might buy Channel 4 and what impact might they have? Who wants to come in? David?
Well, there's very obvious buyers like Discovery, Viacom, Comcast, etc. And you know, it's worth noting that the Channel 4 business model is clearly suboptimal. A standalone broadcaster is a very inefficient way of running Channel 4. When I was running Channel 5, I offered Channel 4 a deal whereby we would merge all our back office functions, finance, HR, whatever, and the savings available to the two of us from doing so was £130 million a year. So if Viacom were to take over Channel 4 and merge all those functions, even leaving the programming people entirely separate, clearly there's massive savings that could be generated, and hopefully all that would be reinvested in content. That's what Viacom did when they took over Channel 5. In fact, Viacom volunteered for a tougher remit when they took over Channel 5. Not that Ofcom asked them to do it, but they volunteered it. So there's a lot of opportunity there for outside buyers. And actually, Alan, I don't think it's anything really to do with IP or terms of trade, because the way Channel 4 negotiates at the moment is that it discounts the IP in the license fee it negotiates. And by the way, it still collects a lot of IP. It has currently 35 people working in rights exploitation. So for an organization that doesn't have any IP, that's a remarkable thing. And the other thing I think that any outside buyer would look at is how efficient internally is Channel 4. Channel 4 pays by far the highest wages of any media company in this country. The average cost per employee of Channel 4 is £100,000, and they employ 912 people at a cost of over £90 million a year. Now, that's the first thing I would go for if I were the owner of Channel 4, which is to cut that very, very large wage bill significantly. Interestingly, during the recent epidemic, Channel 4 cut its program budget dramatically by 23%. It increased its wages bill internally. So you get a sense of where Channel 4 currently stands in terms of its internal efficiency. So I think there are buyers, but it will depend upon what the terms of the purchase are, because I think this is an opportunity for the government to impose tougher rules on a privatized Channel 4 than it's currently able to impose on a publicly owned Channel 4, which is paradoxical but true.
Okay, does anyone have any thoughts on that? Is that plausible that the remit, for what it's worth, might actually be strengthened under a private sale?
I would come in here and say that if you look at economic theories about regulatory capture often says, right, and this is not always, but often says that regulation of private companies can be, right, tougher than regulation of public companies, because in public companies, you're more prone to regulatory capture. That's where the regulator basically is in hand and glove with the people they're regulating, because it's more or less one set of nice chum public servants, like talking to another bunch of nice chum publicly owned servants. So there is a risk of regulatory capture when you do have when you have a publicly owned company. Similarly, there is a risk of regulatory capture when you have a private company, because the regulator, people who work at the regulator, often want to move and earn far larger income by moving to the private company, right? And so what we need to do is that we need to actually get some proper economic theory in here, right? And look at how do we avoid regulatory capture? And there's risk of regulatory capture for a privately owned company, and there's risk of regulatory capture for a publicly owned company. Right? And that's what we really need to guard against, because whether Channel 4 succeeds or not and how tough its remit is, a lot of it has to do with Ofcom. Right? I completely agree with Alan that a lot of it is to do with its culture, and its culture is strong, and it had a very strong, but I think that culture was built up from 20 years, right, from its launch all the way up until 2003, right, because of its tough remit. Right? And I think its culture is actually a legacy of its tough remit that was imposed by Ofcom. And the fear is that as time progresses, cultures change, right? And so the fear is that if we don't ensure that we keep on, that Ofcom doesn't do a good job, if we don't ensure that we toughen its remit, right? Eventually its culture will change. Its culture will change to the point, let's not look through rose-colored glasses, right? In 2020, in the height of Black Lives Matter, right? Channel 4 apologized for Bo Selector, for the blackface comedy that it did, right? What on earth was happening before 2020 that nobody recognized, right? That it took Black Lives Matter and massive protests globally to recognize that blackface was not acceptable, right? What on earth was happening at Channel 4 to recognize that the tribe next door, right, in 2019 was not acceptable, right? Now they have apologized for Bo Selector, right? And they've taken down the blackface comedy, which was highly offensive. And it now admits it's highly offensive, right? But it had a culture and still has a culture where that was allowed to happen, right? So it needs really tough and rigorous regulation, right? So I think otherwise its culture will just keep on slipping, because the Bo Selector culture is not the same culture which gave us the Desmonds when it launched, which gave us the Bandung files when it launched, which made them finance the Chedo Black Film Collective when in the 80s, right? And so it's cultural slip. But I completely agree with Alan. It still has a strong culture. We need to make sure that we reinforce that culture.
Well, let's chat for a while, shall we, about diversity of voices and representation, given Marcus has made those really important points. Because obviously I'm coming to you from Scotland, where Channel 4 News has a presence and we're growing. We have teams as a news programme in Wales and in Manchester, as well as the core programme, of course, in London. And of course, a big part of Channel 4's focus at the moment is moving away from London, building its base in Leeds. So while Marcus is up and while he's made those really important points, I would like to ask you really how important is a commitment to diversity of voices for any media company, and can Channel 4 lead the way in that mission? And does it need, as you've been suggesting, some sort of regulatory framework to achieve that? And just to bombard you with questions, is that possible when you're looking at a private buyer, shareholders, profits, and all the rest of it?
Is that to me?
That's to you. Just pick up on that.
Okay, fine. So, all right. So I was head of BBC Scotland Current Affairs for 8 years, right? And while I was there, Channel 4's news presence there was absolutely negligible, right? And so, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was other things that Channel 4 did, and Alan can definitely give evidence with regards to what it was commissioning, the programs. But in terms of news, its presence was negligible, right? And the reason its presence has been strengthened is because of Ofcom, right? It wasn't because it culturally wanted to go out there. It wasn't because of its public ownership. It's because Ofcom has forced it to go out of London and have a larger presence outside of London, right? And so, as I keep on stressing, and I think that's brilliant. I think it's brilliant it's got a larger news presence in Scotland now, right? That is absolutely great. But we need to look at what was the actual cause of that, right? And what we need to do is focus on Ofcom. And then the question is that will Ofcom be able to regulate it better or worse if it is privately owned, right? And so that is the question, and it's a complex question.
Can we ask Alan that question?
Yeah, God, there are so many questions within that, Ciaran. So let me go back for 2 seconds on the runners and riders, because I think David is right in who they identify, but I would make 2 points. Having negotiated both with Channel 4 over many years and with these big American companies, let me tell you, there's a fundamental difference. Channel 4 cares if the independent sector survives. The big American companies could not care less, And the idea that any savings, which would be significant if Viacom or Discovery picked up Channel 4, would automatically be reinvested into programming, I would suggest is fanciful, in my humble opinion. So just to deal with those 2 points. On the out of London point, I think that one of the great benefits, and maybe one of the only benefits of being so fantastically old as I am, is I've lived through at least 3 or 4 waves of the nations and regions are going to be the big issue. And I remember chairing the debates at the TV festival that were always put on at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning because nobody could care less. But this time, the move outside of London by the PSBs, particularly the BBC and Channel 4, is real and, again, in my opinion, irreversible. And I think, yeah, Marcus is right. Maybe they were dragged kicking and screaming to that point, but they have now embraced it. And if you look at not only the Channel 4 news presence in Glasgow, but the fact that the Channel 4 itself in Glasgow, which is not even their biggest hub, has Joe Street, who has, I think, the biggest single budget at Channel 4, lives in and works in Glasgow and has done for many years, though very proud to come from Doncaster. She's very committed to living here, and she is the biggest single checkbook. And that's what matters. It's not fine words or remits. its cash and commissioning power. And that move is now irreversible. However cynical we want to be, and I agree with you, Marcus, maybe you're right, however cynical we want to be about the roots of that, it is now real and tangible and, as I say, irreversible.
I was just going to add to that. There are real numbers sat behind this that it's really worth understanding. So, Channel 4 will this year, spend 50% of its original content budget in the nations and regions. That's a quota that they've hit 2 years ahead of target. That's £200 million worth of investment in original production in the nations and regions. It's a really significant amount of money. They are responsible for 40% of all PSB spend in the nations and regions on originations. It's, their commitment to the nations and regions, I don't think can be questioned.
I would question its commitment, right? Its commitment to the nations and regions now can't be questioned. Absolutely, completely agree with you. Its commitment to the nations and regions previously, right, I would question, and I would say that its commitment is primarily due to Ofcom's regulations.
But Marcus, with the greatest respect, how they've got there isn't really the debate, is it?
It's the fact that they've got there. It is the debate. If we're debating, it is the debate. It is the debate, though. The reason the reason why it is the debate, Mel. Sorry to interrupt. The reason that it is the debate is that if it is actually, sorry, my son is screaming in the background, right? If the debate is about privatization, we need to see whether it got to the nations and regions because of its ownership, because of its regulation. If it is because of its regulation and its remit, would that regulation and remit be sustained because of its privatization? So it is completely relevant as to how it got there, because how it got there will decide whether it will maintain if it is privatized or not privatized.
Let me ask, one of the questions you posed almost is about whether we would have got to this point if Channel 4 were in public ownership or private ownership. But what do you actually think yourself? Do you believe there are merits and benefits to public ownership? What might be at stake? What might lose?
Ciaran, can I
Marcus,
chip in here?
Just before you do, David, I'll ask Marcus that question, and I've got a question for you that I've been teeing up.
So I think the debate with regards to public or private ownership is what model would create the two questions. What model will create the best surplus in order for there to be investment into the indie sector, right, throughout the country, right?
What do you think? What's the answer?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I suspect that it's public ownership, right? But at the same time, it's interesting listening to David saying that there are ways in which they could actually rationalize with regards to their salary or teaming up with larger corporations. So, I don't think it's a simple one, but I would suspect it's public ownership. I would suspect. Okay. Right.
We've heard Melanie.
And the second question is whether in public or private ownership, which one is easier to regulate? Right? Because I would contest that it's its regulation which has caused it to go out to the nations and regions. It's its regulation which caused it to have news and current affairs where it is. So it's making sure that whichever model it is, which one is easier to regulate. So those are the two primary questions.
Okay, and before I bring David back in, I mean, can I just ask you, Melanie, I mean, can you think of programs that just wouldn't have been made if Channel 4 were operating under a private model, under a Netflix model?
100% I can. So, Educating, which we made for many years at 2-4, and was a actually phenomenally successful rating story, and provided the channel, I think in 2014 or 15 with its highest rating series of the year, was commissioned absolutely as a piece of public service broadcasting. When we got the green light on that, the sort of thought process, the internal soundtrack of the channel was, nothing about schools will ever rate. This is an important thing to do, but we should understand that no audience will ever come to this. And actually, of course, you know, we had the happy surprise of finding a way to shine a light on teenagers that meant we actually garnered a really significant audience for that show. But I don't think people would have taken the risk. You know, there were historically shows about schools never rated. Nobody outside of Channel 4 would have ever taken the risk to put that programme on. And much more recently, you know, I feel really heartened when I see the channel doing things like the Joe Lycett show, which, you know, I have young teenage children. That's their favourite show on Channel 4. You know, could I persuade my teenage son to watch a traditional piece of consumer affairs television? Absolutely not. But when it's put through a Channel 4 lens and handed to a fantastic comedian, you bring a new young audience to a genre of television that traditionally wouldn't appeal to them. That's a very, very Channel 4 way of doing things that I think is super serving young audiences. You know, we have to remember Channel 4 serves more young audiences than any other PSB in the UK. You know, their digital numbers speak for themselves. You know, they've got double the growth of digital that you're seeing at ITV. They are doing very, very well with that specific audience, and that audience is part of their remit. That's who they are out there to serve.
Here we go, David. You wondered what Channel 4 news programmes could be considered public service broadcasting outside of news. Melanie's given you some examples just there.
Well, I'm not sure whether Joe Lycett is comedy or current affairs. If it's current affairs, it's very oddful. Bear in mind,
it's consumer affairs, David.
Channel 4 ran, for what it's worth, for a decade after it launched, which was a straight consumer affairs show, which actually my company Thames produced. There's nothing new about that. And as for moving out of London, the Channel 4 board virtually resigned when it was forced, or would have been forced by the government to give up its London headquarters, and it required a change of chief executive and a change of board mentality before they committed to Leeds, Bristol, etc. So, as I understand it, one of the things being contemplated by the government in the consultation is to require the new owner to close the London offices altogether and to commit itself to Leeds as its not just notional national headquarters, but actual national headquarters. We should remember that Channel 4 is responsible for 5% of the independent sector's turnover. It was hugely important when it started. I was there as one of the very first independent producers working for Channel 4. Fantastic. And as Mel says, there are plenty of programs that only Channel 4 would have commissioned. There's no reason to imagine that a new owner would give up the things that Channel 4 has built in terms of its audience appeal. Why would it? But what you would
sorry to jump in there, David. Do we really believe that, Alan? Would a new owner take the same risks?
How can you tell? Look,
can I bring in Alan just there for a minute? We haven't heard from you for a while.
No. Go ahead, David. Be my guest.
Thank you. The notion that new owners won't take risk is, you know, it just what are independent producers? 800 of them. They're all owners of small businesses who are taking risks. Some of them are owners of larger businesses. Channel 4 currently spends more with big non-qualifying independents than it spends with small or qualifying independents. And by the way, the largest contract that Channel 4 has is with Love Productions, 70% owned by Sky Comcast, 25 million a year for all the Bake-Off programs. It spends £5 million a year with each of the non-qualifying independents it commissions, £1 million a year with each of the qualifying independents. There's room for a lot of things for the independent lobby to do with government in saying what we want if you privatize is the following rules to be applied. And by the way, none of the quotas that Channel 4 has entered into, courtesy of Ofcom or legislation, is enforceable. There are no penalties if you fail to meet a quota.
Okay.
With a private owner, you can have penalties and you can monitor it much more carefully, and you can say, you will pay a £5 million fine if you don't do X. So that is one of the things that the independent sector, instead of clinging tightly to nurse for fear of something worse, look positive. Imagine a bigger future with a better regulated future.
Thank you very much. Sorry to cut you off. Nothing personal. We've got 10 minutes left, and if there are audience questions, we do send them in through the chat function. But in the meantime, we'll carry on this conversation and bring Alan in on that point. Do you agree with David?
No, well, to an extent, that I'm no apologist for Channel 4, and anybody who's had the 200 coming from Glasgow who's had the £250 coffee flying to London to be told the meeting's cancelled. You know, no apologies about Channel 4's arrogance and metropolitan nature in the past. I think it's much, much better now. And however we got here, Marcus, and I get your point, however we got here, we are now here. And I worry that a privatised company would not, yet the government could do it. But if you look at the tradition of American takeover, forget the media, of UK companies and the promises that are made when they first come in and how long those last, I think that should be a salutary lesson for us all. And all I can tell you is, having dealt with both, I know who I would prefer to be having my negotiations with.
Okay, I mean, we're talking about production companies and programs made in the nations and regions, but I want to talk just a little bit about the diversity of voices and about reaching audiences and communities that perhaps others, or perhaps Channel 4 itself doesn't reach, but should be. So how do we improve that? Marcus?
I was going to say, since I'm responsible for Dairy Girls, do I get to say that? No.
Oh, Alan, yes, you be that voice. I mean, if we'd have had Lisa, I mean, she would have told likewise about the importance of Dairy Girls, and not a voice we've seen much of on mainstream television. But Marcus, do you agree that Dairy Girls wouldn't have been made by anyone else?
The short answer is, I don't know. And the longer answer is, it wasn't made by anybody else, right? So that I absolutely have fallen in love with the with Alan's philosophy phrase, which I hadn't heard before. You know, in practice, it was commissioned by Channel 4. So irrespective of the theory, of the hypothetical, Channel 4 commissioned it, and it should be commended accordingly. You know, at the same time, you know, you look at Netflix, and Netflix is doing some amazing stuff with regards to non-English language programs. You know, so I'm accessing programs which are not in English to a degree which I wouldn't have and I wasn't doing previously. You know, and if we're talking about Scotland, we want to ensure, or we're talking about Wales, S4C, we want to ensure that when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about Scots, we're talking about Gaelic, we're talking about Welsh as well. You know, so I think that there are different models which are coming up, you know, but there have been some beautiful and wonderful examples of Channel 4 championing diversity. There have also been, you know, examples of Channel 4 of other broadcasters championing diversity. You look at Small Axe at the BBC, right? So Channel 4 is not hasn't got a monopoly on being able to do diversity and diverse.
Okay, and let me bring in Melanie and just put to you a point that Juliet has made in the chat, which is that Channel 4 doesn't only support the indie community, but all the suppliers to those companies whose businesses depend upon their successes. And she says that big US companies are highly restrictive with third-party suppliers and dictate market terms. Melanie?
I think Juliet is right. You know, I suspect that she's referring to the music publishing with that question. And she's entirely correct to say that, you know, there are a lot of restrictions around if you're dealing with an American broadcaster, making sure that you use music that that they already own. And so that would obviously be, you know, detrimental to a business like hers and, you know, challenging for a business like us creatively. I think also just on the previous point, you know, one of the things I think it's important for us to all talk about is, you know, in many ways, I think for me, Channel 4 has the perfect model. You know, it is not run for profit. Only a publicly owned broadcaster can prioritise public service over profit. That's just a fact. You know, the Channel 4 model is set up so that it's got creative and commercial success, and it can use that commercial success to then fund other bits of the schedule that are going to be potentially less commercially successful, but really important to Great Britain and to society. You know, and that comes at no cost to the taxpayer whatsoever. And so for me, I think the question is, why, if it's not broken, why is the government asking to fix this? You know, they've looked at this before. They had a review of this in 2017 and concluded that Channel 4 was, better served by public ownership. Nothing has changed. Channel 4 is currently sat on the biggest surplus it's had. It's about to deliver for the first time £1 billion worth of revenue. It's a model that really, really works. It's spawned a fantastically vibrant independent sector, that has allowed us to export billions of pounds worth of IP around the world and has put us on the map as one of the foremost content creators on the globe. So why does anybody think it's a good idea to actually change that?
Well, let's open it up to the panel. We've heard David talk about efficiencies. Alan?
Efficiencies that, if they were delivered, would of course flow straight back to the bottom line of the conglomerate who have bought them. That's how business works.
Mel, I'm surprised to hear you say that. Most of the candidates to buy Channel 5 don't distribute dividends or profits. Discovery doesn't. Liberty Global hate profits. They only want to build businesses. When I was running Thames TV, a privately owned company, we did vastly more public service broadcasting than Channel 4 does now. And by the way, I commissioned 6 hours of Northern Ireland drama, Stuart Parker's Lost Belongings, for Channel 4, which Thames co-produced. Until recently, Channel 4 was producing less than 7 hours a year out of Northern Ireland after 38 years of its commitment to multiple voices. The notion that profit is something that is the only thing short. What most media companies want is growth. And the way they grow businesses is they invest. When I launched Channel 5, my shareholders invested at full risk £300 million. They had no guarantee of making any money at all. They've never paid a dividend. They grew the business substantially. By the time I left, it was worth about £1 billion. It then went the other way and reduced in value to 100 million. Broadcasters take risks all the time. It's nothing to do with private ownership or public ownership. As Marcus has said, publicly owned companies are really hard to regulate, because what are the penalties? When the BBC libels Cliff Richard, we pay for it, not the management. When they run a program,
because we've only got 3 minutes. We've only got 3 minutes left, and if there are any more questions from the audience, it would be lovely to hear them. And I just wonder if Marcus or Alan has any thoughts, any final thoughts about ultimately why we are doing this. And David's talked about private companies being more interested in growth, but surely private companies, their raison d'etre ultimately is to make somebody money somewhere down the line. Otherwise, why bother?
By growth.
Alan or Marcus?
I would briefly say, right, that I am not an advocate for privatization. Right, what I am an advocate for is that, and what the debates all over the country and on RTS and broadcast have highlighted, right, is that what people love about Channel 4 is that it invests more money in indies, right, and it does have a multiplicity, when it's at its best, of diversity and commissioning programs that nobody else commissions. And if that's what we love, we need to find ways to ensure both. And I would contest that it is seeing how it makes its surplus or profits in order to be able to do that, and how does the remit or its regulation ensure that it does that, right? And if it is best served through private ownership, which I doubt it is, then we should go down that road. If it is best served by public ownership, which I strongly suspect it is, then we should go down that road. but we really need to revisit its regulation and its remit.
And a final thought from you, Alan. If you wake up in future and find that Channel 4 is now owned by a US private media conglomerate, how would you feel?
Yeah, do you know what? You would do business with it just as the way you would do business with everybody. I think that's not really the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is this going to make things better? And I think, as Mel said, we looked at the issue in 2017 and the Tory government backed away for it. I don't think it's by any means a coincidence that following Dorothy Burns' McTaggart lecture, which lambasted the Prime Minister, that we're looking at this again. And I don't think there's any commercial reason to do it. There's certainly no creative reason to do it. I think it's vindictive and pointless. But of course, we are in business, and if the ownership changed, of course we would do business with the new owners. But the idea that those new owners wouldn't chafe against any regulations that were placed on them, any remit that was placed on them, I think is fanciful. And I don't think that reflects, obviously David's worked in much more charitable private industry than I've worked in, but I don't think that reflects the realities of the commercial world at all.
Okay, and I thank those in the audience who've written some questions at the last minute. We're not going to have time to get to them. Melanie, have you got just a final thought that you can sum up in 30 seconds?
I mean, I think my position on privatisation is pretty clear. I suppose what I would say is to all of the independent sector who are out there and are wrestling with this debate, if, like me, you believe that the privatisation of Channel 4 is, a potential threat to our sector, then stand up and be heard and make as much noise about this as possible. Because it seems to me from the outside that the government have already decided what they want the outcome of this to be. And the only way that we're going to change that is by kicking up as much fuss as we possibly can. Okay, thank you to all of our panelists for that really engaging, interesting debate. We're going to be keeping a close eye on this. It's all coming to a head very soon, isn't it? It's amazing. But thank you to Melanie Leach, Marcus Ryder, David Elstein, and Alan Clements. I'm sure the conversation goes on. But yeah, cheers everyone, and thanks everyone for tuning in to watch it as well.